All right, so let's jump right into it. The situation in Ukraine. I mean, it's a lot to unpack, and we've got this CBS News article here. It really highlights, I mean, some pretty intense stuff going on.
Yeah, definitely. And I think what's really striking is how we're seeing, on the one hand, this escalation of Russian attacks on Ukraine's energy facilities. But then on the other hand, you've got Zelensky pushing for a truce. It's almost like a high wire act, trying to balance those two
You're
things.
totally right. It's like trying to have peace talks in the middle of, a war zone.
Yeah.
This latest attack that's described in the article with all these missiles and drones targeting infrastructure all across the country. I mean, this isn't just a random act of aggression, is it?
No, not at all. I mean, it fits a pattern that we've been seeing, especially with that 3-day assault on Odessa's energy grid just before this. It seems like Russia is really strategically targeting these facilities, trying to cripple Ukraine, not just militarily, but also by disrupting everyday life.
Yeah, and the article actually mentions that DTEC, which is Ukraine's main energy supplier, they're reporting attacks on their Odessa facilities for like the fourth night in a row. I mean, can you imagine trying to live with that hanging over your head?
It's got to be just brutal for Ukrainian civilians. And, it's easy to get caught up in all the geopolitical analysis, but we can't forget that real people are at the heart of this. Their lives are being turned upside down.
For sure. But with all this turmoil going on, Zelensky's call for a truce, it almost feels audacious. He's proposing a halt to all aerial and naval attacks as a first step towards de-escalating things. It's not just some simple plea for peace, though, right?
No, it's definitely more calculated than that, especially when you consider the timing of it. It comes right after that really contentious meeting with President Trump where the U.S. decided to at least temporarily pause their intelligence sharing and military support to Ukraine.
Whoa, okay, so that's a huge development. This pause in support from the U.S. What's the thinking behind that? I mean, it seems like it puts Zelensky in a really tough spot trying to negotiate peace with one hand tied behind his back.
Yeah, it's a tricky situation for sure. The article doesn't go into all the specifics of that meeting, but it's clear that U.S.-Ukraine relations have become strained. And this pause in support, well, it just adds another layer of complexity to Zelensky's peace push.
So he's kind of walking this tightrope trying to project strength in the face of Russian aggression. But at the same time, he's extending an olive branch. How's that being received by the international community?
Well, it's not being completely ignored. At least Turkish President Erdogan has come out and said he supports the ceasefire idea, and the proposal itself kind of echoes a recent French initiative. So there might be some diplomatic momentum there.
Okay, so there's a glimmer of hope at least. But what about Russia? What's their reaction to all of this? I can't imagine they're exactly thrilled with the idea of peace talks right now.
You're right on that one. The Kremlin has been pretty clear that they're rejecting the ceasefire idea. They claim their attacks are these precision strikes targeting what they call Ukraine's military-industrial complex. It's basically an attempt to justify the continued bombardment.
Classic information warfare tactic. You know, framing aggression as this necessary and surgical response.
Yeah.
But when you see the civilian casualties and the consistent targeting of civilian infrastructure, well, it's hard to see it as anything other than an attempt to just break Ukraine's spirit.
Yeah, exactly. The Kremlin's rhetoric often doesn't match the reality on the ground. They're trying to create this image of measured strategic action, but the collateral damage tells a different story. They're aiming to cripple Ukraine's ability to function both militarily and as a society.
Which brings up a key question. Is this strategy backfiring? I mean, will this relentless pressure force Ukraine to give in? Or will it just make them more determined to resist?
That's the big question, isn't it? It's a high-stakes gamble for sure, and the outcome is anything but certain. This is where understanding the psychology of conflict becomes so important. We need to analyze whether this pressure cooker environment will actually force Ukraine's hand or just make them even more determined to fight back.
And how does that U.S. support pause play into all of this? It seems like it's a pretty big blow to Zelensky's negotiating position.
There's no doubt it weakens their leverage. The U.S. has been a crucial ally providing not just military aid, but also vital intelligence. This shift in U.S. policy, well, it sends a message whether they intend to or not, and that could embolden Russia and make a peaceful resolution even harder to reach.
This is complicated. But let's step back for a second and look at the bigger picture. How about the EU? The article mentioned that they're boosting their defense capabilities. Is this a direct response to the potential for the U.S. to disengage?
Oh, absolutely. There's a growing sense of unease within the EU. They're realizing that they might not be able to rely solely on the U.S. for their security anymore. And this raises some really interesting questions about the future of NATO-European defense cooperation. The whole landscape of global power dynamics could be shifting.
This feels like a potential turning point, not just for Ukraine, but for the whole global order. Are we witnessing a power shift here with the U.S. taking a step back and the EU stepping up?
It's definitely a possibility worth considering. But before we get too carried away, there's another player we need to talk about: Saudi Arabia. The article mentions a meeting between Zelenskyy and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Al Salman. That seems pretty significant.
Yeah, it does.
As
Especially since they haven't really been major players in this conflict up to now. What's their angle? Are they just trying to be peacemakers, or is there something more strategic going on?
That's where things get really interesting. And that's what we'll dive into right after this. Saudi Arabia getting involved. It's definitely intriguing. It feels like they're really trying to make a statement on the world stage, you know? And this conflict, well, it gives them a chance to flex their diplomatic muscles a bit. Maybe even reshape those global power dynamics.
Yeah, it's like they want more than just a seat at the table, though, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Saudi Arabia has its own interests,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to energy. How does that factor into their role in this conflict?
Oh, you're absolutely right. They're not
Wow.
just stepping in out of the goodness of their hearts, their economic interests, especially in the oil and gas markets. Those are definitely a big factor here. Any instability in the region, especially a conflict that drags on and involves major energy producers like Russia and Ukraine, well, that has huge implications for Saudi Arabia's economic strategy.
So they're making a calculated move then.
Hmm.
By positioning themselves as mediators. Well, they can try to influence the outcome in a way that benefits them. But it's not a simple equation, is it? I mean, this conflict is so layered, so many moving parts.
Absolutely. And that's what makes analyzing the potential outcomes of Zelensky's truce proposal so fascinating. When you consider all the players involved: Russia with their aggressive stance, the U.S. kind of stepping back, the EU trying to figure out their role, and now Saudi Arabia entering the scene, it's the complicated picture.
It's like a giant game of geopolitical chess.
Yeah.
Every move has these ripple effects that you can't predict. But let's talk about those Mirage jets for a second. The article mentioned that they were used for the first time in this recent attack. Does this change the game at all for Ukraine's defense capabilities?
It's a big development for sure. Those French-made Mirage jets, they're not messing around. They give Ukraine a much more advanced air defense capability, something they desperately need against Russia's air power.
So it's a good thing for Ukraine,
Yeah.
but not a silver bullet. I guess Russia still has a pretty big advantage overall when it comes to military strength.
Exactly. We got to keep things in perspective. While those jets might shift things a little in the air, they're not going to single-handedly win the war. This is about a much bigger strategic picture.
Okay, so back to that potential truce. Let's just say, hypothetically, everyone agrees to stop fighting, at least for a while. Is that even realistic at this point?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Even if you get past the first hurdle of getting everyone to agree to a ceasefire and forcing it in a situation as volatile as this, what's a monumental
I
challenge?
can only imagine. You'd need some sort of international monitoring force, right? And even then, how do you guarantee that everyone will actually follow the rules when there's basically zero trust?
You hit the nail on the head: trust, or rather, the lack of it. Both sides have been pushing these intense propaganda campaigns, and their narratives about the conflict are completely opposed. Building enough trust to make a ceasefire work, let alone last, it's a Herculean task.
And it goes beyond just stopping the fighting, doesn't it? Even if there's a ceasefire, those underlying issues, the territorial disputes, the historical baggage, the political tensions, they don't just disappear overnight.
You're right. A ceasefire is just hitting pause. It's not a solution. You have to address the root causes of the conflict, the stuff that fueled this whole thing in the first place. That's the real challenge. And that requires everyone to actually talk to each other, to compromise, and to try to see things from the other side's perspective.
That sounds almost impossible given how much animosity and distrust is built up over the years.
It's definitely a challenge. But history shows us that even conflicts that seem impossible to resolve can find a way through diplomacy and negotiation. It takes patience, persistence, and a willingness to find common ground.
But let's play devil's advocate here for a second. Say a truce is put in place, but then one side breaks it. What happens then? It feels like the whole thing could fall apart instantly.
That's a real concern. Ceasefires are inherently fragile, especially in a conflict like this. Any little thing could be seen as a provocation. Any misstep could reignite the fighting.
It's like a house of cards. One wrong move and it all comes crashing down.
It's a delicate balancing act, no doubt. And even with the best intentions, there's always the risk of someone miscalculating or things escalating. That's the nature of conflict. It's unpredictable, and that's why it's so important to understand all the nuances and complexities involved.
Okay, so we've talked about Russia, the U.S., the EU, Saudi Arabia. Are we missing anyone else in this equation? It feels like there's another key player out there.
You're right. We can't forget about Turkey. They've said they support Zelensky's ceasefire idea. And they're in a particularly interesting position in all of this. They're a member of NATO, but they also have close ties with Russia.
So they're walking a tightrope then, trying to balance those relationships while also playing the role of peacemaker.
Exactly. They've been actively involved in trying to mediate talks between Russia and Ukraine, trying to find some common ground and de-escalate the situation. Their role is crucial because they have the potential to influence both sides.
It sounds like they're really trying to use their unique position to do some good in this whole mess.
They are. And their involvement could be a major factor in determining whether this conflict spirals even further out of control or whether there's a path towards some kind of resolution.
Okay, so we've got all these players, Russia, the US, the EU, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, each with their own motivations and strategies. It's kind of hard to keep track of it all.
It is complex, and it's constantly changing. But amidst all the uncertainty, there's one thing that stands out. The international community is finally starting to take this crisis seriously.
Yeah, you're right. There's this sense of urgency now, a realization that the stakes are incredibly high,
Man.
and that doing nothing is just not an option anymore.
And that's a good thing, because at the end of the day, the only way out of this is through collective action, through diplomacy, and through a shared commitment to finding a peaceful solution.
But even with all these efforts, it's hard not to feel uneasy. Like things could still easily go off the rails.
I understand that feeling. This conflict has really shattered any illusions we might have had about the stability of the global order. With the U.S. seemingly stepping back from its traditional leadership role, the future feels very uncertain.
But couldn't this also be an opportunity? With all these old alliances shifting and new power dynamics emerging, isn't this a chance for some fresh perspectives and new solutions to come forward?
There's always potential for positive change, even in the darkest of times. And maybe, just maybe, this crisis will be what pushes us towards a more collaborative, more equitable world order.
That's a hopeful thought. And I think we could all use a bit of hope right now.
Definitely. And the best way to stay hopeful is to stay informed, to have thoughtful discussions like this one, and to keep trying to understand this complex world we live in.
Well said. But before we wrap up this deep dive, there's one thing we haven't really talked about yet. Those French fighter jets. The article mentioned they were used for the first time in this recent attack.
Yes. The Mirage jets. They definitely add another layer to this whole situation.
So tell me, how much of an impact do they really have on Ukraine's defense capabilities? Could they be a game changer in this fight?
That's a great question. And one that deserves a closer look. Let's dive into that right after this.
All right, so those Mirage jets, they kind of feel like a wild card in all of this. Are they really a game changer, or is that overstating things?
It's easy to get excited about them, especially since Ukraine has been on the defensive for so long.
Yeah.
But I think we need to be careful about getting ahead of ourselves.
Right. It's easy to get caught up in the hype when you hear about new weapons. But you're saying we should focus on the bigger picture.
Exactly. The jets definitely give Ukraine a much-needed boost to their air defenses. And the symbolic value is important, too. It shows that their international partners, especially France, are committed to helping them defend themselves.
And I bet seeing those jets in action is a big morale boost for the Ukrainian people and the military.
Absolutely.
Huh.
But we have to remember that Russia still has a much bigger military overall, so these jets might not completely change the balance of power, at least not right away. It's a step forward for Ukraine for sure, but it's not a guarantee of victory.
Okay, so a development worth watching, but not necessarily a turning point in the conflict.
Yeah.
Speaking of turning points, let's go back to that question you brought up earlier about the potential problems with the ceasefire.
Yeah, that's the question that really gets to the core of this whole situation. If a truce actually happened, what would be the biggest challenges to making it work? And how could we stop things from escalating again?
It's a big question. Where do we even start?
Well, one of the most immediate challenges would be setting up a way to monitor the ceasefire. You'd need some kind of international peacekeeping force on the ground with the authority to watch troop movements, make sure everyone is following the rules, and investigate any potential violations.
That sounds like a logistical nightmare.
Yeah.
Trying to find a force that both Russia and Ukraine would agree to, and one that could actually function in that kind of volatile environment. It's a lot to ask.
It is, and that's just the beginning. Even if you could figure that out, you still have to deal with the underlying reasons for the conflict. A ceasefire might stop the fighting for now, but it won't magically solve all the deep tensions between Russia and Ukraine.
You mean things like those territorial disputes, the historical baggage, the political disagreement, all the stuff that caused this conflict to begin with?
Exactly. And those issues have to be addressed directly if you want any chance of a lasting peace. It takes real dialogue, compromise, and a willingness to understand each other's concerns.
which, given how much distrust and animosity there is right now, seems pretty much impossible.
It's definitely not going to be easy. But we have seen examples in history where conflicts that seemed impossible to resolve were eventually settled through diplomacy and negotiation. It takes patience, persistence, and a willingness to see things from the other side's point of view.
So I guess we have to hold on to that hope, that even in the middle of all this chaos, there's still a chance for peace.
I think so. And maybe this potential ceasefire, as fragile as it might be, could be a starting point for those important conversations. It's at least a little bit of hope in a really difficult situation.
Well, I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about today. We've looked at the complexities of this conflict from different angles, the motivations of the key players, the potential problems with the ceasefire, and what it all means for the international community.
And hopefully we've done it in a way that's both informative and engaging. Our goal is to give our listeners the knowledge and insights they need to understand what's going on in this complex world.
So until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep asking those tough questions.
And remember, the search for understanding is a journey, not a destination.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.